Hello and welcome. My name is Roni Firon, and this is The Bigger Picture, where we sit down with experts to hear about their journeys, their insights, and the big ideas that drive them. Stay tuned for today's episode. In today's episode, I spoke with Professor Reuven Dar, a clinical psychologist and researcher who studies OCD. Ruvi and his colleagues have developed a model that approaches OCD in a different way from the mainstream consensus. They've come up with a framework for OCD called seeking proxies for internal states. The idea behind this is that individuals suffering from OCD have a harder time accessing their own internal states. And in order to deal with this, they seek proxies, or things that are external to them, in order to gauge what exactly their internal states are. This is quite a different way of looking at OCD, and it shines a light on the difficulties that these individuals often experience when trying to understand what exactly they themselves are feeling. So their ritualized and compulsive behavior become these kinds of external crutches that help them gain more certainty around their uncertain evaluations of their own internal worlds. We talked about the different symptoms of OCD and how they can manifest on a spectrum. One of the important notes that came from this was that, like other psychological disorders, a diagnosis of OCD is only made when the symptoms are truly interfering with the individual's life, functioning, and well-being. We also spoke about OCPD, or Obsessive Compulsive Personality Disorder, and how it differs from classic OCD. Ruvi and his colleagues have done something that I particularly admire. They've looked at a certain accepted consensus and said, we're not quite sure it's accurate. When ideas are widely accepted in any field in science, it's hard to reopen that area of inquiry for further examination and to perhaps reevaluate certain things that were held to be true. Any endeavor that takes a second look at things with fresh eyes is a laudable step towards the pursuit of truth and is, in my opinion, embodying the true spirit of science. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Professor Reuven Dar. So today on The Bigger Picture, we have with us Professor Reuven Dar. Welcome, Ruvi, and thanks for joining us today. So I'd like to start by asking you, what do you think a lot of people misunderstand about OCD?
Good question. First of all, I think people don't have a clear understanding of what compulsions and obsessions are. And you often hear people use the word obsessions to describe compulsions and vice versa. I think for many people, it's just a very strange disorder. And I think some people would think, oh, they're crazy. They have these strange obsessions or beliefs, or the word beliefs is complicated, but beliefs, or they hold on to some very strange beliefs, like, if I think a certain thought, then I can cause things to happen or prevent things from happening. So, I'm not sure how much people know about OCD. It's a good question.
So you mentioned obsessions and compulsions. Mm-hmm. Can you make sense of that for us?
Sure. So obsessions are sort of the mental part. So obsessions are thoughts or images that people experience, and they feel that they just have them. So they don't feel that they're active in producing them, but just appear. And they produce anxiety or distress or sense of disgust or guilt, negative experiences. And compulsions are the acts that people do. Usually it's a behavioral, for example, like, washing your hands or checking things again and again. That the motivation for that usually is to reduce the distress that is caused by the obsessions. But compulsions can also be mental. So people may have compulsions like counting or saying that's not going to happen 3 times, or trying to reconstruct the events in their day. So, for example, if I'm afraid that I may have touched something contaminated, I may reconstruct where I was exactly, and could it be that my hands really touched something that seemed suspicious to me? So compulsions could be mental, but the big difference is obsessions are something that I experience as just happening to me, so I don't initiate them. Whereas compulsion is something that I initiate and I'm motivated to do them in order to reduce the distress that is caused by the obsessions.
Interesting. There's something in that where it feels like it's coming from outside, or it's not associated to the self, the obsessions.
Right. I think it's true. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But I think also some people may feel that the compulsions are also not exactly, they don't have a sense of agency about the compulsions as well because they feel compelled to do them. So they might say the OCD makes me do all these strange things.
Right. It's an externalizing of a certain aspect of yourself. And it's not, it doesn't feel like this belongs to me. It's not your essence.
Right.
It's something that's external.
Right,
okay.
Right.
Now, you and your colleagues developed this new paradigm around OCD called seeking proxies for internal states. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So the main idea in our model of OCD is that people with OCD have difficulty accessing, knowing their internal states. So internal states in this definition is everything like from emotions. I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know if I understood something that I read. But even I don't even know if I'm hungry, and I don't even know what my muscle tension is. I'm relaxed or not relaxed. And because they don't have access to these things, they begin to rely on proxies. And proxies are substitutes for the internal states that I can feel more certain about because maybe they're more objective. So, for example, if I don't know how much I love my girlfriend, I can count the number of text messages that I sent her, or I can see how much money I spent on gifts for her, right? So I have all these objective, what we call proxies, that substitute for my difficulty in accessing my sense of love for my girlfriend, okay? It's an example. If I don't have a good sense of whether my hands are clean or not, then I develop a ritual that has very clear components, and I go by order, and I wash every finger first, and then I wash the gap between the fingers, and so on. And then I finish my ritual. That for me substitutes for the difficult to access sense of cleanliness that I want to achieve.
Interesting. And how does this approach differ from the classic definition of OCD?
It's very different. The definition of OCD is just people who have obsessions and compulsions, right? And
period.
Period. That's the definition of OCD. Some people have talked about difficulty in accessing specific internal states, but like maybe guilt. And they think of OCD as something that is restricted to particular kinds of concerns, like contamination, safety, and so on. We think that the deficit is general. It's sort of content-free. I mean, it's true that, phenomenologically, people with OCD are concerned usually with specific kinds of themes, but we showed in our research that the deficit in accessing internal states this is not limited to these typical concerns. And that's a very unique thing in our model.
Okay, there's something that comes up for me with that, where it seems like, in a sense, the issue is striving for certainty, where certainty can't actually be achieved, and then using the proxies to achieve some sort of certainty. And it relates to me to certainty specifically because we often think of OCD as being a disorder of excess of control, right? Of order, an excess of control and of order.
You mean a need for control?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, in a sense, would it necessarily only be internal states, or would it just be the striving for certainty in a very uncertain world?
Okay, so there are many models of OCD that stress the need for certainty and talk about OCD as having a problem with intolerance of ambiguity. So they need a certain certainty, and they can't tolerate it when things are not clear. But we don't think that's the whole explanation. Clearly, there's doubt and there's need for certainty. But what we showed in our studies is that they actually have deficient performance, not just that they have excessive doubt about their performance, which they do usually. I'm just conducting meta-analyses on these issues of confidence in performance. But they actually perform less well compared to people with other anxiety disorders. So I don't think the story is limited to doubt or uncertainty or need for certainty.
Okay, so you're saying that this is really a matter of, when you say performance, they're really unable to access their internal states compared to other people who can.
Right.
Who can access, and therefore the over-reliance on proxies.
Right. And I agree with you that they do want to be sure about their internal states, right? And we only see this in actual patients or in actual phenomenology when they have a concern about a certain internal states. If they don't care, then they don't ask the question. But if it's important to me to decide if this woman is right for me, and do I love her enough, or am I religious enough, then I begin to want to access my internal states, and then I want an answer, right? But just the need for certainty enough doesn't explain these kinds of behaviors, I think.
Okay, and I have another question, and I know this is a difficult question to answer methodologically, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think causes this? Do you think it's an inbuilt trait? Is it genetic? Is there some neurologic correlation that you guys have found? That's
the $100 question. So we don't really know the answer to that. We haven't looked at, we don't do brain research, so we haven't looked at the brain correlations. There are some studies that looked at that. I don't think the findings are very strong, either genetic or brain studies. Now, where does it come from? Is it something that people, grow up with and then they become more vulnerable to developing OCD? Or is it already the result of having some OCD? So we don't really know the answer to that. It's very, very difficult to answer methodologically, you said, because you need to take many, many people, assess if they have difficulty accessing their internal states, follow them up, from, being kids to being adults and then see how many people develop OCD. And that's a very, very difficult kinds of study to do. Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you could have a childhood where you weren't given the chance or you didn't have models that showed you how to access your own internal states. So you didn't get that practice. Mm-hmm. Or perhaps you were genetically predisposed to not be able to access your internal states.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, do you see OCD as being on a spectrum from perfectionism on one side to a full-blown diagnosis on the other?
Yeah, I think there is... I think it is a dimension. I don't think perfectionism necessarily is what you see on the less pathological side. But yeah, if you look at scales that measure the severity of symptoms of OCD, which we've done, then you find the whole range, even in students in psychology, right? And many of the studies we've done is we've taken people who are either low or high in terms of their scores on these OCD measures, and we showed that lows and highs are different in a very similar way in which people with OCD are different from people without OCD or people with anxiety disorders that are not OCD. So yeah, I think there is a range, but at the same time, when you have OCD, you have OCD. I mean, I think when a person comes to the clinic, it's easy to diagnose. It's not just a person who has many kinds of concerns about safety or about morality or about order. It's a person with OCD, right? And so I think, I don't know exactly. So I'm saying two things that may sound like they contradict each other. On the one hand, there is a dimension very clearly, but I don't think, for example, that all the people who score highly on OCD questionnaires have OCD. Okay, so it's both. I think it's a dimension, but it's also a disorder.
So do you think that, when we kind of in our culture use the term OCD almost, we almost use it too. Almost use it a little too easily to just describe someone who's a little bit of a control freak or a little perfectionistic. You think that's incorrect to do?
Yeah, it's incorrect. In the same way that when you joke about somebody that is autistic, that thinks guy just doesn't read social cues. Right. That's not really the same as being really on the spectrum of autism necessarily, or having autistic disorder. So, and I think the other thing I would mention is that there is a difference between OCD and OCPD, which is the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So I think when
you
talk
tell us about that?
So, right. So these are people who have concerned with morality, with order, with perfectionism. They have great difficulty letting others to relying on others to do their job correctly. They are very much busy with work at the expense of free time and having and spending time having fun. They're not able to have fun. So there are people who are they're not aware of having this problem, right? As opposed to OCD. So people don't come for treatment and saying, I have an obsessive compulsive personality. It's something that we observe in these people, that they're very rigid, very compulsive in the sense that they must do things in a certain way, but they don't have obsessions, right? And they don't have rituals in the same sense that people with OCD have them.
Okay, but it is kind of from the same family as you're describing it.
So that's it used to be a theoretical issue. So early theories of OCD thought that it was a continuum, that you start from having this kind of personality, and then what Freud, by the way, called analic, right? The anal personality. Right. And then you can develop from that base, you can develop the actual disorder. Today, it's considered an empirical question. So you can measure OCD, you can measure OCPD, and you can measure the extent to which they're related. Certainly in the student population, we find a very strong correlation between the two.
So OCPD is considered a disorder? It's considered a personality disorder?
It is a personality disorder, right? Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder.
Because, from the description, it sounds like there are a lot of high-functioning people with OCPD.
Sure.
And okay, so
there are also a lot of high-functioning people with OCD.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Because there is something in that compulsion that if it's channeled into the right places, right, or into productive places, then you can...
Right, but by definition, if we talk about a personality disorder, we mean something that's not functional. So it goes beyond being functional. So the person, for example, can be so busy preparing something that they never actually get to do it. Or they can so busy with the details, they never see the big picture. They never get to finish assignment because they're so perfectionistic. So when it's a disorder rather than just what we call spectrum or tendencies, then it's by definition has to be dysfunctional.
Right. So this ties into another question that I wanted to ask you, an idea that I wanted to run by you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that most psychological disorders, as they're defined today, they're really normal adaptive behaviors that have become extreme. So that most disorders are based on behaviors that have had an evolutionary basis, but that in these disorders, the behaviors manifest in excess and become pathologized. So what would you say to that?
I think it certainly makes sense in some pathologies. So I think if you talk about, including OCD, and we can talk in a minute about why that might be the case, I'm not sure it's true about schizophrenia.
Right.
But yeah, so for example, if you look at phobias, right? So phobias are fears of things that in our past, in our ancient past, it made sense to be afraid of them, right? So people are more afraid of cockroaches and snakes than they are afraid of drug dealers and car accidents, right? Because they didn't exist in the time in which the fear system developed. And certainly it's easy to see why fear is adaptive at a certain level, right? It protects you from danger. People have talked about the evolutionary basis of OCD. For example, some people think that in animals it's comparable to nesting and grooming behaviors, right?
This ritualistic.
Yes, and that you can find similarities between them. And that maybe, for example, ordering is something that if you order things in a certain way and you know the order in which you put things, then if an invader comes in, you would notice that something has changed, right? So people did talk about the evolutionary basis of some of these behaviors. checking, cleaning. You can see why that they might have in a certain context, they might have evolutionary advantages. And yes, and then you can see that when it goes bananas, basically, then it becomes non-functional.
Right, because the operating system is there for a reason, but, the operating system might go haywire,
Exactly.
in a sense. So I wanted to ask you on a personal level, what fascinated you about OCD specifically?
Well, it's a good question. I probably arrived at working with OCD not by any intention. So I was a student and a graduate student, and there was a clinic at the psychiatry department that did behavioral therapy, and I needed the money, so I went and joined them, and I did exposure therapy with phobias and with OCD. And I can tell you a moment in which I found this to be a very interesting disorder. I think it is. I think it's just fascinating that you see people who are, again, some of them can be very high-functioning people, and they have these crazy ideas and crazy behaviors, at least from the outside to the outside observer. And they're very different from each other. And I think there's a huge range of ideas that people develop about that are, obsessional ideas, or create this obsessional reality to which they respond with rituals and with rules and norms and all this stuff that people with OCD do. So I think it's fascinating in terms of its inventiveness in a way, which contrasts with fairly normal functioning in many areas of people. Very successful people may have OCD and you would never know because they're able to hide it and it's sort of encapsulated in their lives.
Can you give us some examples of these creative obsessions that people might have?
I have to be creative here because I don't want to point out to any real patients. So maybe somebody can develop the idea that certain numbers are very dangerous, and being in any way reminded of these numbers or being close to these numbers is dangerous for that person. So say the number is, 7. And anytime I see something that reminds me of 7, it could be at the time, it could be the number of cars I've seen passing by me, it could be a number of license plate, it could be the channel of the radio to which I'm listening. I have to do things in order to correct this and to get out of the state of the 7 state, you can call it, okay? People may doubt very, very basic facts which you would not normally doubt, right? So it could be internal states like we mentioned, but it can also be, am I alive? Maybe I'm already dead, stuff like that.
That sounds like a philosopher's question, really.
It's very interesting because I once wrote a paper with students of mine about the relationship between philosophy and OCD. So we talked about doubt on the one hand and certainty on the other hand as two ends of a continuum, where delusions represent certainty, or too much certainty, because people that have delusions can't doubt them. And you can't help them by saying, that this doesn't make sense, or can you think of other possibilities? They are very, very certain about the reality that they believe in, whereas people with OCD doubt everything, right? And we talked about philosophy, and particularly philosophy of science, which tends to recommend being more certain than more doubtful. So there is a relationship. If you doubt everything in science, for example, if you begin to develop a theory and you begin to test it, and then you doubt every step of the way and you stop to question yourself, you cannot make any progress. And that, by the way, is true for our general cognitive biases. For example, people tend to be overconfident, right? And overpositive. And that is adaptive because that helps you to go forward and not stop every second and question yourself, which people with OCD tend to do.
Interesting.
So a bit of digression, but yeah.
Yeah, no, when you said doubt, it immediately jumped into my mind Rene Descartes, and this constant doubting of everything, and am I alive, and what can I actually know, and fantasies of demons that might be controlling my perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
So about the number 7 that we mentioned before, does something in a person's life trigger them to associate this negative meaning around the number?
About the number 7. In the case I'm thinking about, he couldn't recall anything that brought this thing to life. I mean, some people can remember specific incidents that for them they believe were the trigger, but many people don't. And also when you look at the course of how this disorder develops, sometimes it's sudden and sometimes it's not. So, for example, I did have a patient I can talk about because many, many years ago, whose disorder started from they in their basement. This was not in Israel, and they had a basement, and there was and the sewer came out of an opening in the basement. They had to clean it up, and that was for her very much clearly the trigger of her OCD. So she began to develop OCD around contamination related and more remotely related to this sewer coming out of the basement. But for many other people, they can't recall anything that was the trigger, an obvious trigger to their problem.
Interesting. And when you talk about something like that, I think that anybody would be traumatized by that kind of experience. So what in her response was considered a disorder?
So she began avoiding everything. First of all, the basement became a problematic place for her. And unfortunately, the washing machine and the dryer were in the basement, which is typical in America. And she began to develop more and more complex rituals around the washing, clothes washing. And she had to wash the clothes several times, and she even would talk to the machine and sort of try to convince the machine that to clean well, sort of almost praying. Then she would gradually get to the point where she wouldn't want to put the clothes from the machine into the closets because that would contaminate the closets. That's something very, very typical in OCD, that you have this chain of association that something contaminates something else, and then that thing becomes contaminated and contaminates something else. And eventually she got to the point that she had many rituals related to contamination. For example, when she walked in the street, she would try to avoid sidewalks in which they had this sewer openings. She would tie her shoelaces to a very tight knot on top of the shoes so they don't touch the ground. She would return home and wash everything, like her backpack and the books even that were in the backpack and the shoes and everything. She wouldn't let people come into the house because they could bring contamination in the house. She washed everything in the house, like door handles and phones and stuff like that. She ended up sort of the house was all contaminated in her mind to the exclusion of some hall that she could walk in. And she found herself walking naked one day in that hall because all the clothes were contaminated. So she became very, very severely ill with this. And she could clearly point out to that event that you call traumatic, but it wouldn't necessarily be traumatic for you, right? I mean, even if you would hate, you wouldn't like thinking about that. I mean, you had to do it, you had to deal with it, but I don't think necessarily in every person it would develop these kinds of associations and spread to the point that it was spread in her case.
Right. Yeah. No, that does sound debilitating. Like you really can't live your life.
She couldn't. She had to be hospitalized. I mean, that was a very severe case.
I was just thinking about my own experience where one summer here in Tel Aviv there were a ton of cockroaches, even more than usual. In my apartment, the summertime at night is like when they like to come out, and I was, in my experience, it was a little bit traumatizing when your whole house is under attack. So My response to that was I have a summer protocol where when the sun sets, the windows, if they don't have nets on them, they're closed, and like there's a door to the roof, and I put a towel under it. Might be a little excessive,
right?
But I can live my life. So
right.
That I understand is not considered in the definition of OCD.
First of all, it would be more like a phobia, right? Because you don't do any rituals. It's more,
right.
I mean, the behaviors that you describe are very reasonably related to what you're trying to avoid. And that's not like that in OCD, right? There is one of the definitions, or part of the definition, is that the behavior is excessive or is not directly related to the stuff that you're trying to avoid. In your case, you're trying to avoid being in contact with these, and many people have, phobias of cockroaches. So you were acting rationally, maybe excessively, but rationally.
Okay.
So same thing with people who, right? And your obsessions, I mean, your thoughts didn't appear to you to be strange or sort of ego dystonic, as they say. They didn't seem to you strange or didn't make sense. They made perfect sense to you.
Right. And in the evenings, there are no cockroaches.
Yeah. So success.
So success, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to ask, when you're working with individuals who have OCD, how do you help these individuals?
To the extent that they do. So, there are tried methods of help working with OCD. The main...
You mentioned exposure therapy.
And response prevention, right? These are the two components, right? Exposure is when you help people. If we think of that person that I described before, that she had all these avoidances, right? She wouldn't walk in certain places. She wouldn't go to the basement, or when she did, she would try to stay away from that opening in the basement. She would not let people go into the house. So there is a big avoidance component, which is like in phobias. What brings people to therapy with phobias is when they avoid things, right? If they can't fly, they have flight phobia, then they come into the... So you work on one component of the treatment, and that's not my treatment. That is the most established treatment for OCD, is the component of exposure. So you help people to not avoid the things that they tend to avoid, like not touching things or not being in certain places which they feel are dangerous and so on. The certain component which is specific to OCD as opposed to phobias or other fears is what's called, I'm not sure it's a great name for it, but response prevention, which is you help the person to reduce the amounts of compulsions or rituals that they normally do in response to the obsessions. So if a person, has a 20-minute ritual of washing their hands, you try to reduce it gradually, use less soap, use less towels, less repetitions, and so on, or delay it or avoid it altogether. So that the idea is you now have this fear, try to stay with it and try not to do anything that would immediately reduce it, even though the temptation is very clearly there. I mean, who would want to suffer from feelings of, distress or dirtiness or anxiety? But you need, in order to break the cycle of this having fear and then doing the ritual, you need to try to stay with the fear, not respond to it as you typically do. So that's something that I think is a common component in all the treatments of OCD that has a behavioral component. Another component is how you deal with the obsessions. So people feel that they can't tolerate the obsessions because they evoke so much distress or anxiety. And one way to help them is to help them to disengage from the content of the obsessions, to not necessarily to argue with them, but more to just let them be there without acting on them, without, people tend to, assign or attribute meaning to the obsession. So if I have these images that I'm throwing my child out of the window, that must mean that I'm a very bad mother and I might act on it. So I must, not have these thoughts. Or if I have them, then I have to make sure that I'm not around the child because I might act on it. So one component of the treatment is to help people take some distance from their obsessions and just look at them as thoughts and nothing more than that, not something that means something about who they are, what their wishes or motivations are. In our model of what called the SPIS model that you mentioned, the Seeking Proxies for Internal States model, we think that the reason that people with OCD attribute so much importance to their thoughts is because they're less connected to other internal states. So with this example of mother or father who hold their baby and have this fear that they would throw him out of the window, normally I think if you have this kind of image as a mother, you have other sources of information that would tell you that you're not likely to do it because you're connected to your love, to your baby. You have more assuredness about having no motivation to throw them out, and so on. So I think that would balance a fleeting thought like that, and you wouldn't necessarily feel afraid. But if all these sources of information are attenuated, as we think they are in OCD, then I think that thoughts become a very central source of information for you, and that's why they're so frightening.
Interesting. In the mindfulness community and the meditation community, there's this quote of "Don't believe everything you think," right?
Exactly.
And it's this learning that thoughts kind of appear on the stage of consciousness. And in a sense, for all of us, it's a question of are we thinking the thoughts or are the thoughts, showing up? Mm-hmm. So it is taking a little bit of distance from the thoughts and not necessarily, attributing meaning or associating our identity with the thoughts themselves.
Exactly right. So I think that's a very important component of helping people deal with their obsessions.
Interesting. And also when you were mentioning the mother, having obsessive thoughts about throwing her child out the window, I heard this one, Brene Brown. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she has this saying where, when everything is good, and for instance, in the evening when your children have just gone to bed and they're so peaceful and everything is good, that's when you think of the worst thing that could happen to them. Like, that's when you start dress rehearsing tragedy, she calls it, right? And it's this almost in a situation where you love something so much, or when you're so happy or so grateful, you're
also so vulnerable at the same time. Sure.
Exactly. And then these thoughts of what would happen if I lose that thing. So definitely, I think there's something almost natural about it, but it's that an ability to put space between you and the thought.
Exactly. And if you do mindfulness, then you know about all these exercises that people do in order to take some distance from their thoughts. So, for example, you can train people to write these thoughts down, mock their thoughts, like, say them in the voice of Donald Duck or something, write them in different fonts. So, for example, if you speak Hebrew, you can write them in English letters and so on. Or you can imagine sitting in a movie theater and your thoughts are appearing on the screen and you're just observing them and letting them go without doing anything with them. You don't respond to them. You don't have to do anything without them. So all these exercises are designed to help people just observe their thoughts mindfully, right? And not do anything with them. Right. Which can be helpful in OCD.
There's like a dissociation that happens when you externalize it in that way.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Even through comedy, right? There's something like there's a wire in your brain that it takes a different color almost, when you package it in this different way.
Right. There's a form of therapy now became very popular called acceptance and commitment therapy. You know about that. And,
yes, of course.
And they have this saying, "Oh, thank you, mind, for that." Right? Another great idea that you just produced for us. Wonderful. But and you sort of mock it and you take a distance from it and you don't believe it. They call it diffusion. You don't fuse with your thoughts, but you diffuse with your thoughts or from your thoughts.
Right. And I think, comedy in general has this ability to look at whether it's, true facts or realities of life that might be negative, but to put a funny spin on them, right? It is this way of dealing with things that are difficult, right?
Yeah.
So in this seeking proxies for internal states model,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned that people have a hard time, accessing internal states and emotions in a sense.
Emotions are one of the internal states, right?
Right. And also physiological states and things like that. Have you found that people who have OCD also have a hard time feeling empathy for other people? Is it also on that level?
That's an excellent question, and I don't think there's a lot of research on it. I would predict that they would have difficulties having empathy, but I'm not sure how specific this is to OCD. I think that people need distress in general that we see in the clinic, whether they have anxiety or depression, have hard time caring about other people. They're, self-absorbed in a sense. I don't mean it pejoratively. They're self-absorbed in their own difficulties, and I think they would have hard time really empathizing or caring about other people. What's interesting about OCD is that many of the symptoms appear as if these people with OCD really care about other people. For example, there's this fear of causing harm to other people. So it seems like they seem to be very caring people. But I think it's really more about fearing guilt, fearing that they're afraid of feeling very guilty of doing something immoral, rather than really caring about hurting other people. So I think it's more fear of guilt. And there are several theories of OCD that focus very much on guilt as being an essential component of OCD. I don't think it's always the case. But I think
what do these theories say?
They say that OCD often revolves around fear of guilt and specifically deontological guilt, which is the guilt of when you do something that breaks a societal taboo, something that shouldn't be done. But we actually did a nice study that shows that the caring is really probably more caring about not wanting to feel guilty rather than caring about other people. There's a nice paradigm that we didn't develop that shows that if people are made to feel guilty or to think about something they've done which was immoral, and then they're given an opportunity to wash their hands, then the hand washing reduces the guilt.
Wow.
Which is a general phenomenon. It's called the Macbeth effect, and it's been replicated nicely, I think, at this point. And what we've done is we did the same kinds of paradigm. We don't need to get into details, but we did this with people with OCD and without OCD. One of the measures that we did at the end was, again, not our invention, is that we tell people after they either wash their hands. So first of all, they think about something that they did which they feel bad about, in terms of morally bad about. Then we give them some reason to wash their hands or to not wash their hands. And then we tell them a story that there is this PhD student that needs help in running an experiment. And would they volunteer to help her? So what typically is found is that people who don't wash their hands are more keen to help because they still feel guilty and they still need another way to relieve them of the guilt. So if they do something nice, that would help them. We found this very strongly with OCD. So if people with OCD did this, and those who washed their hands, none of them wanted to help this person. So, and those who didn't wash their hands were very likely to offer their help. So that really suggests that it's not that they care about this other person. They don't want to feel guilty. If you relieve them of their guilt, which washing seems to be doing very effectively, then they're not interested very much in helping other people. At least that's the conclusion from this study. Yeah.
No, of course. I think there's something about guilt in general, these certain themes that have been popping up that, OCD does seem to, I don't know if you found this, but it seems to correlate with trait conscientiousness, from the Big Five personality theory. Because a lot of these themes of attention to morality, attention to guilt, and the need for order, right? And even more so your description of OCPD.
Yes, I think it's exactly right. So I think people with OCPD, conscientiousness is one of the core criteria, right, of the core components of OCPD. With OCD, it really depends on the type of OCD. So I don't think every person with OCD is worried about guilt. I think some don't. But I think for those who do, then conscientiousness becomes something that almost by definition is a concern, right? You want to be okay in terms of societal norms, of doing the right thing.
Right.
And so on, yeah.
And there's another thing that kind of jumped at me where, we think of religions, and we think of religious activity in general. There's the ritualistic aspect of it. And there's very much a concern of morality and almost this excessive guilt. You see it in this idea of original sin, for instance, of, thinking of ourselves as inherently guilty, right?
Especially in Christianity and Catholicism, I think. Less so in Judaism, I think.
Right.
I remember that I heard a story from a priest who had OCD, and he told me how it all developed, and it started from his thought that he was committing all these sins, for example, masturbating, and he told me these things were called mortal sins or double mortal sins, which sounds very, very scary. So naturally, when you have these thoughts and these fears, I mean, it sounds like more people should have OCD, more Catholic people. There are some studies, by the way, that compare religions. I'm not sure how conclusive they are, but even in Israel, there were studies that looked at the extent of OCD in the Orthodox society or community compared to non-Orthodox society.
And were there more?
I think there were some more, if I remember correctly. What is clear is that those people who did have OCD tended to have OCD around religious themes, like am I praying with enough intent, right? Or am I conscientious enough about keeping the mitzvot and the Sabbath and so on and kosheress? So you can really get, it invites, right, OCD, these very specific rules that people have to follow.
Right. It's a question of, the chicken or the egg. There's something in it where perhaps this, built-in tendency of a certain percentage of the population to lean towards OCD, perhaps that also invited the evolution of religion itself and the rituals and things like that. So
I think what you're saying is that rituals have a function.
Right.
And it's true. There's a very nice paper that's been almost 15 years ago was published about why people have rituals. And they did combine rituals in religion with rituals in OCD and talked about the similar function that they serve. And I think, it serves the function at least of putting some order in your life, that you feel that things have a reason, that if you only do the right things, then you're promised certain rewards. And there's a way to guarantee things, we all struggle with this uncertainty in life, and having these kinds of rules and rituals is a comfort.
Absolutely. I don't know if you know Alain de Botton.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he has this great lecture about religion. Religion for Atheists, it's called, something like that. Very, very nice lecture. And one of the things he mentions there is that basically one of the things that religions get right is rituals and repetition. And, he says we're simple beings. We need to be reminded of the lesson, right? And today in the university, we go and we learn a subject once in the lecture, and then we're expected to know that thing. And he says it isn't so, right? In religions, they were smart to this. They knew this. So every week you would have the same ritual. You would have, you would repeat reading the same text over and over again throughout your life. And that served as a way to really instill these ideas, and in a positive sense, that can help you program good things into your psyche in a sense.
Yeah, and you could see rituals you can see rituals in young children,
Like what?
Well, young children often want to have things done in a certain fixed order every day. Before going to bed, for example, now I want my, glass of milk, and now read me the same story, and now let's do this. And it's always in the same order, and it has to be very religiously observed.
Yes.
Right? And other disorders also are associated with certain rituals, even the autistic spectrum.
Right.
Again,
right.
and I think it comes from this feeling of needing control. And if you don't have a sense of control and things seem either chaotic or that you don't understand them, then you invent you put some order on things. You create order in this chaotic world, and that is, I think, something that comforts you or reduces your anxiety and you're feeling that you're lost.
Do you find that many people who have OCD have also experienced in their life a lack of control? In the sense of perhaps, they grew up with over-controlling parents or they weren't able to exercise control in their own life?
I don't, and I don't think there is a very strong literature that shows that. In general, I think research doesn't show that specific psychopathologies are associated with specific past experiences.
Right. How would you measure it too? It's so difficult.
Exactly. And I think also if you look, with hindsight, of course, people tend to remember the things that they associate with the development of their problems.
Right, but that's very constructive in the memory.
Exactly. So I'm not hopeful that we will be able to find a specific path that leads people to OCD from their childhood to their
right.
OCD.
Not also a path that necessarily will create OCD, but we might find a
higher likelihood.
Higher likelihood, patterns here and there, general theme. But no,
not yet.
Not yet. Okay, we'll work on that hypothesis. Okay, I wanted to ask, just in general, what advice would you give someone who is looking for a career in clinical psychology?
Wow, that was a big
swerve.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult path to take. I mean, that school takes a long time, and then you have internship for 4 years, and then you have so it's So I think it's advisable to develop some special skills, and to be, I think, a specialist in some area, which could be certain disorders or certain kinds of therapies. Clearly now, for example, if you are a child therapist and you're a man, you might have a relatively easy time because there lack of men who are child therapists. So I think, I'm not sure. I think it is. I do know also many people who've just taken the standard, common path of becoming psychodynamic therapists, and they're doing really, really well. So I think if you're good, you probably will succeed. I can certainly understand why it's interesting for people to take that.
Right. It's not an easy course for sure. But you would suggest for certain people to consider a specialization. Yeah,
if you can find your own special voice or special, see what works for you, where you're good. I certainly, through the years, it became clear to me what I do well and what I don't do very well. And clearly I work better with people with anxiety and OCD than I work with people with depression. So,
why is that? What did you find, if I may ask?
Yeah, no, sure. I don't know. There's something about me that doesn't have the patience, maybe, to work with people with depression, or even though I know that it's a difficult state to be in, I maybe have this feeling that, get out of it. No, I'm not a good therapist for people who are depressed.
But that's important to know. It's important to know yourself and your reaction to certain individuals.
Right. And so I think that's something you find out through the course of becoming a therapist. And you also find out what you do well. So another advice maybe would just to follow that perception, or not, it's not exactly perception, it's that knowledge that you develop about yourself and what you do better and what you don't do well.
Right, because, just in general, there are certain people that you're going to connect to more and certain people that you're going to connect to less. And I think that goes for a therapist as well, right?
Sure.
There's certain disorders, certain kind of flavors of pathologies that might be harder for someone to relate to and to really be able to show up for.
And, it could be that some of it is your own personality. I probably am more obsessive compulsive than I am a depressive person. But yeah, where you find yourself comfortable, where you find that you interact well, effective, basically.
Right. That, in all of that, there is a real honesty about, being honest with yourself about who you are and what you're good at and what you're not good at. And also not letting go of a need to be good at everything or to get along with everyone. Right.
Yeah.
So for my final question, the podcast is called The Bigger Picture. And one of the things that I like to ask at the end is, the bigger picture for me means looking at things from a zoomed out perspective. It's looking at the deeper meaning of things. And in a sense, I would want to know, what would you say is your bigger picture of your work and your life?
Wow. I guess I should have heard some previous podcasts to the end. Sure. So you asked about my work first, right? So I tend to do many things. Maybe it connects to my life as well in general. So I have many hobbies. I'm the person who tends to not be too focused on one thing, not in my research and not in my general. I think I tend to follow my intuition about what I like to do and what I do well. And I'm not sure it's a good advice for everyone. I think it just really depends on who you are. For me, I spend time painting. I spend time reading. Spend time, of course, with my family, with my kids. I wouldn't be able to only do psychotherapy. I wouldn't be able to only do research. I think it's really not an idea. I think it's who I am.
Right. And in terms of, the bigger picture of what kind of impact you would want to have, what kind of impact you would want your work to have, for instance.
Okay, so that really depends on which field. But if we are still in the area of OCD, yeah, I would want that people would have a better understanding of OCD and also maybe develop some new ways of helping people with OCD. That's actually where we are now with our theory and our model of OCDs. So assuming that we are right about people with OCD having difficulty accessing their internal states, how do we help them to improve their access to their internal states? You mentioned mindfulness. We think that's one of the paths that might help people to connect with their internal states. We have other methods. We're in very preliminary stage of examining them, but I would like my work to have some impact on not only understanding OCD, but also in terms of helping people with OCD. I would like to have personal impact on my students. I would like them to develop, to become good researchers, good therapists. Sure, what else?
Beautiful, beautiful. And is there anything about, your model, the seeking proxies for internal states, that you would like to share that any question that I haven't asked about it?
So, I think it has some unique qualities, the model that, for example, the fact that it's relatively content-free, that we don't only focus on things that are obvious, like fear of contamination, of hurting other people. We try to stay away from the content and see whether we can find some basic tenets to the model that are fairly free of content. If we find basic deficits or basic things that may have gone wrong, that from that we can deduce the symptoms that we see. To me, that's a very attractive kind of intellectual project. And
there's a first principles kind of approach to it.
Right. That think if there's anything else to say about the model that we haven't talked about. No, I think that the one concern I have is that so far, almost all the research on the model, we haven't talked about the actual studies, but all the studies that we did to support the model were done here in our lab. Same people did all this work, and I would really like to see it expanding. So we just sent out for a publication. Hopefully it will come out soon. A review of the model, and I really hope that other people elsewhere will pick it up and develop it further.
Right. That's one of the things in psychology that's so important to really show that it can be replicated in different countries, with different researchers and different participants. Amazing. Thank you, Ruvi, for this fascinating conversation.
My pleasure.
For everyone out there listening, thank you for tuning in to The Bigger Picture. I hope you found this conversation interesting. You can find us on all podcasting platforms, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to hit subscribe to stay up to date with the latest episodes. My name is Roni Firone. This is The Bigger Picture, and thank you for listening. Until next time.